Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your slides.
And you can hear me because you answered me. So yes, this is a performance issue, a detective story. That title came from Paul, didn't come from me, but let's, just pretend that this is a detective story and I've got my hat on and my microscope and all that. Basically, we looked at 3 sites and we have various things that came out of some assessments that we did there, and I wanted to share them. These kinds of things are good things to go throughout the year that we, for the various things that we come up with, because it's good to share. But really what it comes down to is BusinessObjects is so growing and so has so many different features now that so many things are part of that administrative role with BusinessObjects. Of course, you have your web application server and you have your cluster and you have your various application servers, but then you have the adaptive processing server that you split up into different pieces, and so it's just sort of growing. Definitely publications and promotion management and all those things come into that role and can affect performance. So we wanted to share some of the things that we found that were easy improvements that can be made almost, or if they haven't been made already, and that have a big effect. And then just some of the little things as we go and sort of how we do assessments. So if you think of the first site of the 3 sites, we have site 1 is a Windows cluster that for an assessment we did there. And they also have a custom portal. So they have the use of like open document reports being accessed through a custom portal access. And they use iframes to do those open document calls. And so they had some issues there. And of course, they had also performance issues, and they had a recent upgrade, which always sort of means sometimes to me, or is a good highlight to me, that maybe there was something that didn't, that wasn't, some customization that didn't get put into the new upgrade, or that's changed in the way that, so I think about, the service pack they came from versus the service pack they're going to. So it's good to know that a recent upgrade happened. The second site that we'll talk about is a Linux cluster. Both Crystal and Webby there, they, again, as often is the case, they're BusinessObjects administrators, excellent in IT, but less BusinessObjects experience because they wear multiple hats. They have to know everything about everything, and they do all sorts of other things besides BusinessObjects admin. So very common, and so there were lots of options there. Again, a recent upgrade, and it was definitely a huge site with a large cluster, lots of schedules. And then the third site, a little bit different, very experienced administrators in BusinessObjects, but their setup was a little bit different. They had a lot of services on each of their servers, so there was definitely the opportunity to focus their servers as needed and maybe do server groups and things like that. But there was some other pieces as far as what their real problem was. So the real problem was that we really wanted to focus on was that their publications at month end would go from the same publication that took 30 seconds, throughout the month, that was a daily publication, would then at month end, because of the load that they had at month end, those publications would go from 30 seconds to 24 hours, or 30 minutes to 24 hours. And that was throughout the month end performance. So definitely a load indication, but they weren't seeing, high memory, overload, or high processing overload or so forth. So they wanted to kind of get a handle on why that was happening. And so we wanted to look at that. So very different sites, which is very common. We go into a site assessment, and we need to kind of get an idea of what this site is all about, because every site is different. And so this is an example of how they all were different. And I'm going to try to pull out some of the things that were sort of common performance problems. But really, when it comes down to each assessment, there's definitely an opportunity for, specific improvements. So how do we approach this? Well, first of all, we know, that the where, when, what's going on, where's the problem, when is it happening, like is it at month end, that kind of thing. So those are the simple questions are always the best to start with. So in terms of where is the problem, is it happening at refresh time only? Could it be a database end kind of problem, or is it happening with schedules or publications? In other words, does it have to do with the job server, or does it have to do with the processing server? Does it happen only when the user logs in, or does it at least start with when the user logs in, they're seeing problems, just in terms of drawing the screen in terms of their web application? So, that might indicate that the problem might be at the web application server. So where the problem is the first question, of course. When does it happen? Is it happening month end? Is it happening, are we seeing certain error messages, which may be an opportunity for end-to-end tracing, or just, looking at what those specific error messages are about. Is it happening when it's going through the load balancer, or can you go directly to the server and it doesn't happen? So seeing where, narrowing down where it's happening. When is it happening when you're running big reports as well as small reports, or is it just big reports? When reports are against certain universes, if it has anything to do with authentication, does it make a difference if they're in different browsers? So all of these things are questions that we ask up front. We usually do a initial question and answer with the client, and from that, usually there's other questions that come from that, but definitely we start out with some of these simple questions. What product is involved? So definitely, are we dealing with Webby? Are we dealing with Crystal? If we're dealing with Webby, do we have the same problem when we use the Webby Rich client as we do with the Thin client, with the browser? So if you're in Crystal, are they using Crystal for Enterprise, or they're using Crystal Reports? Is it all schedules, or just publications, or are there reports that are using OLAP, or are they using SAP, or so various questions as far as which products involved. There's a architecture of business objects, and kind of getting a handle on where the problem is and when it's happening gives you an idea of which pieces of that architecture are involved. So definitely understanding that is part of narrowing down the source of the problem, or what might be causing the problem. So I put this up here. I'm not going to go through it all, but definitely that's part of the solution, is to understand what pieces are involved and where the problem is. At a minimum, you of course want to check and see if things are supported. So if they're using old versions, or even newer versions than SAP supports. So you also want to check, of course, to the sizing. Is it reasonable for the load that's involved? Typically, when we go into site assessments, what they've seen is they're not seeing a sizing problem, and they wonder why they're having a performance problem. So typically, that's the case. But we might have a site assessment where it's pretty clear that it's CPU, or it's pretty clear that it's IO. So there's different things that we can do there. Are there limitations on licensing? Does it matter that you wouldn't recommend that they increase CPU if they've got a CPU license of 3 or 4? So if they've got a limitation on their licensing, then you have to recommend other things. So these are parts of our questions or thoughts at the beginning as well. So of course, we're going to look into using certain tools to capture our information. So some of the tools that we use, of course, is the auditing and the CMS database connection. So we'll run reports that are specific to refresh time and size and data source. We want to know which reports are the long-running reports, as well as which ones are schedules versus not schedules. We want to find out when things run, like if the schedules are, delivered over 24-hour period, or are they all at the same time. So certain things we want to find out from reporting, that's very helpful. We use to start out with to capture sort of a big picture analysis, but it's very useful in the detail it provides as well. So it's a big picture, but it's detailed, is the BI support tool. And if you're not familiar with it and you are an admin, I highly recommend you familiarize yourself, because it's a free tool that SAP provides, and it's available. You can download it onto your desktop and reference your server, and you can get a lot of information from that. It does basically look at all of your, looks at your log files. It looks at the different settings, and it has recommendations. And I'm going to show you this, but it also has little tools as well. One of the ones I like the best is the end-to-end tracing tool. There is some, and also the enterprise aliases. So adding enterprise aliases to users is kind of a nice tool. There is a wiki on it on how to set it up, and there's some pieces to that. So if you install it on your desktop, that gives you a certain percentage of information, like 80% of the information of your server, but you need to have the SAP host agent there in order to get some more detailed information sent to the BI support tool. So you have to load that onto your server, and then there's some information that has to be set up for authorizing some access to your web application server to get information from the web application server. So there's a couple of extra pieces to get that last 20% of information from the BI support tool. But there's a wiki on that, and of course we would help with that during an assessment to get that extra information. So the BI support tool. Let's just take a look at it in case you're not familiar with it, to get an idea of just how much you can get out of it. So you'll see this landscape. When you set it up, you set up the landscape configuration, and then you run the report. And the report would have lots of information that it would give back to you. So it starts out with giving you kind of an alert.
We're not seeing anything. We're not seeing anything yet, Amy.
Oh, okay. Let me stop and restart. Sometimes that's the case when I go to a remote desktop. How about that?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. So, yeah, so you would set the landscape's configuration to point to your server, and then you can run the landscape report. And this gives us, like I said, about 80% of the information if you've got the host agent and the connection to your web application server also set up. It will give you the rest of that. But basically, it starts with, for instance, an alert summary, which gives you kind of an idea if you just looked at it directly. Oh, there's a few overall system alerts, some report execution errors, some server services alerts. This, lets you know where BusinessObjects SAP is considering might be things that are a problem. So they highlight them, and then they give you some information about that. So it's pretty good as far as letting you know pieces that you might want to focus on. Always we'll see something for the platform search service, almost always. In this case, they're noting, for instance, that the web memory analysis is checked on the Webby processing server, and as some of you know, as of version 4, since we went to 64-bit, the Webby processing server should be allowed, generally is recommended to be allowed to use as much memory as it can, as opposed to having the memory analysis turned on. So that's an example of, it gives you those kinds of things, and it might reference a knowledge base article in that. So there's all sorts of alert pieces that will tell you what's going on your server, but it will also give you information in general as far as what you might do about it. What I really like is the server analysis, so I can get an idea of the various things going on. I can see, for instance, on the APS, if it's split, how the different heap sizes that are set across the different split APS. I can look at each server, and under each server, for instance, I can see not just some of the basic settings, but also some of the metrics. So there's some more information down there, as far as how that is working. So, and it looks like through the log files to get an idea of, since the last restart of the SIA, how things, some of the metrics. For instance, on site 3, we were seeing really high request times on query request times. So the max request time, the general request time, the average was like 8, but the max was like 28,000. So, or even bigger. So clearly some issue with the CMS response time. So it gives you the metrics that's happening as well as the settings. So that's really helpful for me when I'm doing the analysis. General information about the content on the server. For instance, if the server has a huge number of Excel files being held on the server, when they could be held in a file share instead. So you can get that information, that stuff off of your repository and make a smaller repository. Authentication analysis, license, etc. So you've got all sorts of information about which schedules are taking the longest and which errors are returned. If there's errors returned from your schedules, if your schedules are, some of the schedules fail, it will give you kind of an analysis of how often some of those schedules or some of those errors are happening. There's some information about which reports are connected or not connected to a universe, and the various connections and dependencies. So all sorts of information that I want to know when I'm doing an assessment. And then the web application, if you've got that connection, you'll have some information about your web application. And if you've got server groups set up, it would have that as well. So lots of information that I can then, that it will give you some ideas of what to do. But I can, as an analyzer, I can come in and see, oh, okay, that could be one of the things that we'd want to recommend based on my experience. So let me go back to here. Are you still able? Do I need to reshare for the PowerPoint?
If you click the screen that you're on, you shouldn't have to continually.
Yeah, I must have not. I've got screen, but anyway, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. That's the only demo I have.
We have a few questions, if you don't mind, Amy.
I do mind. No, yes, go ahead, please do.
So it says, can we get the instruction to download this SAP BI support tool? Was the first one. And like how to download.
So it's available in the downloads. If you've got an SAP maintenance, you can log in with your SID and download it that way. And if we cover your maintenance, then we can download it for you. So yeah, if you just look under the SAP BI support tool, and then, but like I said, if you look under the wiki, you'll also want to download the SAP CAR and the SAP host agent if you want to get that extra 20% of information that from the landscape analysis.
Great. And then the other question asks, most often performance issues go down to your reporting database performance. As a BO admin, what are the checks/tools which can prove handy to identify those issues?
Yeah, so that's why we do the auditing report. I'm absolutely with you on that. If a report is running and it is should be a 10-minute report, but it ends up being a 30-minute report because the SQL isn't optimized, then it's taking up 30 minutes of your Webby processing server. So as an administrator, that's huge, and that's something that you definitely want to optimize. The SQL of reports, so a SQL analyzer of some sort it would be, I usually work with the DBAs. What I usually do is I provide them, with our report, we provide them a list of the top offenders. And then we, in terms of the SQL, and then we, also provide the SQL. and then we work with the DBA is what we typically do. But we also, could just run it through a SQL analyzer if we have access to that.
Great. And then the last question asks, can we get the object level usage analysis report from this tool?
So object level usage, I'm assuming you mean objects within a universe. So 360, eyes is is a great tool that I mentioned later in the next thing, but that combines information from the Java SDK into a database with the CMS information, with the auditing data information, all into one place, and that's excellent. The problem, what this person is getting at is the problem is that the auditing database doesn't necessarily keep object level information in the way that you want it. It keeps SQL. So you can usually reference back a little bit, but it's hard to get all that object information and the usage from the auditing database. There's some extra steps in order to get that information that usually involves using the Java SDK to add to the auditing database. Yeah, I wish that was something that was more readily handy. This does not. Yeah, this is purely from a server standpoint, like what server settings there are. So the BI support tool isn't for that. But great. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I wish that was true too. Any other questions?
That's all the questions we have for now.
Okay. So some other tools that I use, like I just mentioned, 360 Eyes as a good tool for combining everything together, and as opposed to querying the audit database, querying the CMS database, and then also including in that Java SDK level of object information from your universe. There's some options for scripts that can help with that, but but this tool does it kind of for you. So if you have the budget to get 360 Eyes as an additional add-on, if somebody has it, I will use it. Let's put it that way. SQL Analyzer, analyze your SQL for optimizing queries, like I said. We also will look at the Tomcat memory, like with JConsole, or we might do some performance testing with JMeter. So some other tools that we've used. We don't always use, but we will use if we have it. So the first thing I wanted to mention was the big payoff fixes. So when we looked at these 3 sites, there's some things that when referencing big payoff meaning that they make a big difference in how your performance improves. So as mentioned before, slowest refreshing reports, and optimizing SQL, so important. So if you can get a list, just get an understanding of the reports that are not optimized, so that the DBA can put the appropriate indexing out there, or update the indexing, that's great. And really keeping a handle on that is important. But there's also a common one which kind of gets overlooked. If you're a small site, then the Java heap setting that is by default is often enough, but it's kind of set at a trial level. It's set at a sandbox server level, like not really for performance of usage. So increasing the Java heap size is probably one of the most important things that you'll want to do to make sure that you're using or able to use Tomcat to its best advantage. So that's a simple one, and it's definitely a big payoff in terms of your web application server being optimized. Another one that's interesting to me is the platform search service. So there is, under applications, the platform search, and by default it's set to continually search, and you may want that because you have enough of a change level that would be the case. But what we usually recommend is you set it to scheduled, and maybe unless you're looking at the content, skipping the instances, so that it performs faster. And then, so we usually suggest those 2 things at least from at the beginning, and then you would you would go back once you've optimized everything else. You might then go ahead and turn it on to continually after everything else is optimized, because it just takes up so much of the memory on the server. So another option, of course, is isolating it onto another server, or either horizontally or vertically. So there's some options there, but usually we recommend that you start with it scheduled, and then you set it to continually if you need to when you're ready. Another piece of that is if you've got a clustered environment, it's a good idea to put the index in one location with good I/O, so that all the servers are accessing it from the same location. That's kind of a central location. So it's usually a good idea to set the master index on your shared file location. Shared caches in general, so your Webby processing and your Crystal processing, if you've got these if you're clustered and you've got them on multiple locations, then you would want to set those to be shared. So if you've got 4 servers that have Webby processing on each of one of those servers, then rather than having them each have their own cache, having them in that cache in one place so that they're all accessing the same cache, you're going to get more out of cache. So that's kind of a no-brainer there, but it's something that gives you a big payoff in terms of performance. So that's why we mention it. Optimize, we already talked about. Limits on instances. So your instances may be bogging your CMS down. So this is one of the things that often we see if I'm going to go to the next slide because I have it on screen. If we see a CMS that is super slow, sometimes it's a result of the repository being it used to be really small and now it's really big. If it's undergone a bunch of different upgrades, and if there wasn't a repo scan in between to clean it up, and if there's lots of instances out there, all these things lead to a large CMS. And just intuitively, if you query a large CMS versus a small CMS, your queries will be slower. So, the idea there is to just make it optimized, but further, the CMS isn't set to index automatically, so there's some recommendations on making sure that your CMS is indexing, and there are some indexes that are, if you actually look at your CMS, there are indexes out there, but they're not set to refresh regularly. So there's some settings that you should consider on that, on making sure that your statistics update for your CMS to be optimized. Site 1, we used pretty much all the big payoffs that you said that I showed on the previous slide were involved. And one of the things that happens if you've got a lot of these big payoffs, a lot of the little things get overshown, so you can't really see all the other things that might be contributing. So sometimes this is definitely an iterative process of, let's make these big changes, and then let's look at it again, and then let's make those changes, and then let's look at it again. And definitely part of the process of optimizing it can be done best in steps. There's certain things that you don't want to say, this is the number that you should set this at. You want to maybe increase it by 10, take a look at it, increase it by another 10, take a look at it, So those are the kinds of things that involve an iterative process, and that's usually part of our recommendation on certain things. On the things, if a thing doesn't have a downside, we'll usually recommend a number, but if there's a downside, we want to make sure that's very clear that you want to do it iteratively. They also had that custom portal and with an iframe that was accessing their open document, and there is a setting that allows for the token to be passed between the iframes. There's multiple iframes within an open document if you've got input controls especially. So there's some pieces for that where you'd want to make sure that session gets passed in between it, and things happen appropriately. So this is, you wouldn't do it unless you needed it because it's a lower security, as it sounds, but it is definitely one of the things that would, fixed the problem. So that was important. And they definitely noticed improvement. So, but they had a lot of the biggies. They had some things, the Java heap size, for example, needed to be increased. And so that made a big difference with how things performed better. Site two, of course, there were a couple of big payoffs that were involved. And so that's always good for us because we look good when that happens. If we just tell them to do 2 things and then they do them and everything works perfect, it's great. But it's helpful to do Tomcat clustering if you've got multiple Tomcats, to set max threads to be increased, to set up Crystal servers, isolating Crystal especially into different server groups, to optimize the use of your performance on Crystal reports versus your performance on Webby reports. Caching on the Webby, caching all the universes is recommended. So if you've got a lot of universes that people are accessing, the default is 20 setting on the Webby processing server, but universes are small little files, so they don't take up a huge amount of cache. So it's generally a good idea that you cache all those universes for them to be, brought back or opened easy, quicker. So that's an easy improvement. Consider increasing the connections, the amount of the max connections, if you have that accessibility to your database. So a lot of this is working with the DBA to make sure that, if you set up your services to connect to the data, that you're going to be, your database is going to be able to handle that. So, so there's kind of a back and forth between that. Job servers are recommended 1 service per host, and you increase the number of jobs, and you generally increase them along the lines of 5 per CPU for the general recommendation on that. So good performance improvements, and they were, they made some of the big changes, and they saw the performance improvements, and that then they started to make some of the little changes. So so we've continued support with that. So Site 3 had the interesting one with the publications, and they also had very knowledgeable administrators, and so they'd already, they really didn't have a lot of the biggies. They were already working on all of optimizing their queries. They were already, optimizing their CMS. They were very much in the know. There was the, I don't think I have it here, but oh yeah, Webby cache sharing. So there was the setting the Webby cache across multiple Webby processing servers onto 1 shared server. That was helpful, but that was the only biggie that was recommended. They pretty much had a handle on most things. There was, however, some interesting things that have been set over time. And one of the things we do in addition to the BI support tool is that we'll look at the server XML, we'll look at, so we can see the connections that are being made on the Tomcat. We'll look at various other files. And in the server one, they had compression turned off, which was odd. I haven't ever come across that before. So that's the kind of thing that we'll look for. I'm wondering how much of that mattered. And one of the things I want to be able to provide is this idea of, if you do this, you'll improve a lot, or if you do this, you'll improve a little. I want to be able to have a real clear understanding of that. And that's one that I hadn't come across before, so I'm not entirely sure if it will make a big difference or if it doesn't make that much difference. And so I'm interested to see how that one turns out. One of the things that was definitely recommended was they have Lumira as a portal for some external customers to access some documents. So they're not really using Lumira in terms of analysis, but they were using it for as a portal. So it wasn't really a large performance or large processing or memory, hog, but it is known from SAP's position that Lumira, when it goes to access something, will take up a large chunk of memory that the Webby processing or that the other processings might want, and it just holds it in case it needs it. So that's kind of one of those things that the way the service works, even though it's not using that memory, it's holding it. And so SAP recommends, and therefore we recommended that you isolate your Lumira service away from the other services. So I think that one was probably going to be the bigger one that's going to make a difference. Another thing that was the one that we were seeing the CMS large max query request time on the CMS, and so there's still some outstanding tracing that we're curious about there. But there is an option also, because it's not promotions, publications that are being affected. We were wondering about the scheduling threads on the CMS, whether or not basically there's an option in the command line to increase the number of scheduling threads, which what that does is by default it's 2 and it can go up to 10. And what that does is the CMS periodically will look at the different job servers and decide which one is available to send a job to. And so you kind of want it, if you increase it, you want it to look more often. And so if you've got a lot of schedules, it does make sense that you'd want to look more often. So that was one of the things that we recommended. But that, again, if you don't want to increase it too much, because you might bog down your CMS. So that was, again, one of those that we would say, increase it, a little bit at a time, and take a look at it and see if it makes a difference. But at the same time, we were recommending tracing on that, further tracing, so that we can get more information. Then there's some other little things like relaxed query characters being added to the CMS or to the server XML that handles some things that browsers, some of the characters that Open Document needs to pass values. And so various things you'll find error messages in the logs we will find error messages in the logs because we also look at those and recommend various small things. So we always have a set of high priorities and a set of low priorities. And the high priorities really are performance-wise, and the low priorities are really, getting rid of errors because nobody likes errors. So, and then there's a couple of things that weren't too bad here that are specific to Linux settings that help in processing performance. So they had as a response of some of the things that they applied, they did see that their month end, the following month end after they applied them was very good, but it fell on a weekend, which is typically not so bad. So, but it was still better than the last time it fell on a weekend. So, so that was kind of not that we don't get the same response when it's not one of the biggies. So. That's why I like it when it's the biggies, but I really don't. I want everybody's stuff to work really well. And then I see pictures, so we must be done. So yeah, the next ones are just recommendations over time to continually look back at your environment, of course, and be preventative and working with your DBAs. And then once you've got things, let everybody know that everything's working great, because, why not? Why not toot your horn? So that's it.